In 1998, Capcom's Resident Evil 2 was released on the original PlayStation and became one of the most beloved masterpieces of the 32-bit era. The game remains a fan favourite, proven by years of hype leading up to the release of a 2019 remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake, while maintaining the core structure of the original game's design, modernised the classic thanks to improvements in technology, production methodology, and development budget, just not available to the original. But while the benefits of modern game development certainly helped, Resident Evil 2 Remake still owes the majority of its success to the design philosophy of the 1998 original, and it wouldn't have been anywhere near as impressive had the original's foundations been thrown away completely. So what makes both versions of Resi 2 such premier survival horror experiences? We're going to take an in-depth look at the design changes made to the beloved Raccoon City Police Department area and use it to show how Capcom deliberately subverted veteran players' expectations to do the impossible. Create a fresh perspective on an iconic classic while preserving the original's sense of character. This is Art of the Level. The first Resident Evil was released in March 1996, popularising the survival horror genre beyond a niche audience. It was a tremendous success, and Capcom knew it needed to make a sequel, but simply going with another mansion-like location wouldn't have cut it. The sequel's creators needed to dial up the intensity a notch, so its location was moved from the isolated mansion on the outskirts of Raccoon City into the city itself.
Head to the station! I'll meet you there!
The developers' initial take on the Raccoon Police Department, or RPD, didn't turn out too well. Producer Shinji Mikami went as far as saying it was no fun in interviews, and it was completely discarded, along with the rest of the earliest build of Resi 2. To help save it, Capcom brought in a ringer, the late Noboru Sugimura, a TV writer most famous for his work on multiple Super Sentai series, the Lupin the Third series, and detective drama Taiyo ni Hoero, which was mostly set in a police station. One of Sugimura's most significant contributions to Resi 2 was conceptualizing the RPD as a remodeled art museum. This meant its layout could dramatically deviate from what a traditional police station might look like, and so it went from a sterile facility to a twisted horror maze, just like the mansion before it. Early survival horror gameplay evolved from action-adventure games, like the original Metroid, where the player explores an area but finds a locked door or a puzzle which requires an item they don't possess. The task is to find a key or another item in another location and bring it back in order to advance to the next area. Progress through backtracking can get confusing, but getting lost in a survival horror game is a rite of passage, and what makes the RPD such a special location is how players still manage to find themselves lost in the maze, despite the variety of visually distinct rooms in the station. From both an artistic and functional standpoint, an effective survival horror game needs to have as many distinct locations as possible, while being identifiable within the context of the world. For Resi 2, it means that the RPD needs its entrance, holding cells, parking lot, interrogation rooms, offices, an evidence storage facility, and so on. Incidentally, there were no bathrooms in the original RPD, an oversight the developers corrected in the remake. But bathrooms or not, almost every room serves a purpose within the story, providing players with the items or prompts they need to figure out where to go next. While designs vary from game to game, many survival horrors have a centralised hub location that the player will revisit often. In Resident Evil 2, the RPD's main hall serves this function unambiguously. It's the first room you visit, and its importance is underscored by its size and grand design, with the Maiden statue dominating the view. From a functional perspective, it houses a typewriter to save your game and an item box, which means the player will likely need to return to secure their progress or swap out equipment. From here, the rest of the rooms organically flow out, and a majority of what you might expect in a police station can be found beyond the doors on either side. One of the 2019 remake's greatest achievements was taking familiar spaces from the original and making them feel fresh and more realistic without changing their primary function. Just like in the original, the main hall is your base of operations, but now it includes Marvin Branner, a familiar NPC.
Who are you?
The player will regularly interact with Marvin in person and via radio, and he reassures players that they're not alone, while also drilling home the severity of the zombie outbreak.
If you see one of those things, you take it out. Run. Got it?
It's a new take on the main hall, but nonetheless serves to remind us that this is a safe space, at least initially. Puzzles and tasks were similarly overhauled in the remake. While puzzles served the same purpose, they were largely replaced with new, more grounded alternatives, in an attempt to mesh more seamlessly with the remake's more realistic style. For example, in the original's RPD library, players had to push bookshelves into a certain position to unveil the serpent stone piece hidden behind a painting. In the remake, that bookshelf puzzle has been modified so it simply gives access to a newly fleshed out third floor of the RPD. Yet despite this transition from absurdity to groundedness, although there are a handful of exceptions, the RPD in the remake maintains its sense of character thanks to its respect to the source material. Moving back to the original RPD, there's a variety of ways in which to progress through the station, but your approach means the difference between life or death. The police station is designed so players explore a majority of locations at least once, but most rooms are populated with zombies or other creatures. Resident Evil games rarely mandate killing non-boss enemies. Theoretically, you can avoid all of them, yet the narrow corridors and rooms in this station make this impractical for most. Some enemies should be killed, as leaving them alive may prove to be a problem when you need to backtrack, but it's also possible the player may not have enough ammo. This is where resource management, a crucial feature of Resi games, comes into play. And while survival horror developers encourage this behaviour from players to this day, its effectiveness directly correlates to the ingenuity of a game's level design. The RPD features long hallways that encircle the edges of the map and connect various rooms together on both its first and second floors. The first hallway pulls no punches. This is where Resident Evil 2's iconic liquor makes its grand appearance. It's possible that the player, based on a decision made way back at the start of the game, can defeat the dangerous liquor with a shotgun or bowgun. But if they don't possess those stronger weapons, or have enough ammunition, especially on normal or harder difficulties, this hallway becomes a liability that can severely hinder your progress. If the player can down all the zombies in this and all other hallways, they become safe zones where enemies won't respawn even as the player passes through them several more times. That is until Resi 2 throws a curveball. These hallways have broken windows in them, where zombie arms attempt to grab the player as they pass through. Since the player takes no damage, they might think of this as a scare gimmick, not unlike the zombie dogs breaking through the hallway windows in Resi 1, and be lured into a sense of safety. But later on, if the player neglects to use an optional item to lower the window shutters, zombies break in and repopulate the hallway, requiring them to be dealt with or avoided. The remake builds on the original's love of curveballs and plays even faster and even looser with player expectations. On a basic level, the remake changes several key beats from the original. The liquor, for example, makes its grand entrance a bit later, in the second floor hallway outside the STARS office. The remake heavily alludes to a liquor attack in the equivalent hallway to the original, particularly in the scene where players see a dead officer's body mangled with what can only be a liquor's oversized claw. But the developers stuck with the original's core idea that you're never as safe as you think you are. The remake doesn't just change the order or location of key events, it forces veterans of the original to question every assumption they harboured going into the remake.
What the?
Like the original, efficient exploration of the RPD may very well save the character from danger, but the remake has a much higher barrier to success due to the tight relationship between modernised game design and rearranged level design. So let's return to the zombies emerging through the windows. In the remake, the devs have taken the shutters from the original and replaced them with wooden boards. Like the shutters, the boards prevent zombies from repopulating the hallways, but this time they've become a finite resource, forcing players to choose where they're used. They won't be able to board up every window, so players are forced to deal with recurring enemies throughout their time in the RPD. Even Resi 2's first dedicated boss has to be fought sooner in the remake, when players are much less equipped. The ferocious pipe-wielding G-type William Birkin originally appeared at the very end of your journey through the RPD, but in the remake he appears much earlier when players have only explored half of the area. This makes the fight much more difficult. Originally, players could conserve ammo, acquire stronger weapons, and potentially knock out the first boss easily thanks to efficient planning. but the remake's earlier confrontation forces players to fight with potentially much less ammo and a weaker than ideal loadout. Another stark difference between the original and remake is, of course, the 20 years of work on graphics engines. There's a chasm between the original's archaic, brightly lit, pre-rendered backgrounds with loading screens galore, and the darker, grittier, fully seamless 3D polygonal environments of the remake, which are all powered by Capcom's RE engine. But the remake isn't simply a more beautiful game. By loading all of the game data at the start, the remake allows zombies and other enemies to break through doors and chase players into almost every room, including the safe haven of the main hall. In the original, beelining for a door was a valid strategy. In the remake, it can mean escaping now, but being bottlenecked later on. The original also made aiming at enemies a tricky affair, with an above-the-head third-person camera angle taking its toll on your accuracy. In the remake, players have a much wider field of view thanks to the over-the-shoulder viewpoint pioneered in Resident Evil 4. The remake's seamless world is an even bigger deal in light of the game's enemy design. Zombies and lickers are far more resilient than in the original, and require massive amounts of ammunition to permanently kill. Most players will simply not have the resources necessary, and unlike the original's vanishing zombie bodies, all enemies remain permanent fixtures on the map, whether living or dead. Some even play dead for a while before coming back to life when the player returns. This means the player has to be very thorough while exploring every room with an enemy in it. If any are left alive, it can throw off your strategy. One of the original game's most innovative features was the so-called zapping system. Resi 2 has two protagonists, Leon and Claire Redfield, each of whom have two scenarios, an A scenario for the first player and a B for the second. The game lets players choose either Leon or Claire first, which means that there are 4 scenarios and thus 4 different ways to explore the RPD. While it will take a first-time player 4 to 6 hours to explore the whole RPD before moving on to the next area, the devs spice things up with the B scenario by throwing the trenchcoat-donning tyrant bioweapon Mr. X into the mix. He appears a few times in places to provide shock value, cause players to expend precious ammo, and create some tension at certain points with players who have grown used to the RPD's layout by the time they begin the B scenario. Mr. X's reinterpretation in the remake serves as the biggest reminder that we're playing Resident Evil 2 2 decades later. Thanks to the RE engine's seamless environments, the developers were able to expand on Mr. X's behaviour and thus prey even further on players' fear that he could appear at any second. Mr. X can now go through doors and stalk the player, rather than appearing at fixed points, and he is now largely impervious to damage, whereas in the original he could be knocked down with relative ease. Mr. X even breaks the rules set in the original by chasing players through the first floor of the main hall, despite its perceived status as a safe haven. The redesign of Mr. X speaks to Resi and modern survival horror as a whole, having a penchant for stalker enemies, many of which the original Mr. X inspired in some form, including the well-received Nemesis in the original 1999 Resident Evil 3, Jack Baker in Resident Evil 7, and Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village. The Resi 2 Remake's Mr. X offers players a new dilemma as they backtrack through the RPD. The quickest route may now be impassable with Mr. X around, and if the player left any rooms with enemies still alive, those enemies, particularly lickers, could put a major spanner in the player's ability to outrun Mr. X. To make things more difficult, Resi 2 actually does force players to pass through a room that's been repopulated with zombies and lickers in order to retrieve a key item with Mr. X in tow. Hopefully, players will have stocked up enough grenades or flashbangs to get by, or use any other viable strategy they can come up with in the heat of the moment. Resident Evil 2's strong and respected source material meant Capcom was walking a delicate tightrope when it made a remake. It needed to resonate with modern gaming audiences who survived over 20 years of creative and technological innovation within the survival horror genre, while also respecting the importance of the original as a cornerstone of that genre. Yet despite that gargantuan task, Capcom was successful. The original made its mark in gaming history thanks to its compelling gameplay, level design, and story. Resi 2 was a game that lured players in with its eerie locations and delivered on the promise that nothing was as it seemed. Capcom did this despite the relative lack of advanced technology in 1998. Meanwhile, the Resi 2 remake was deliberately crafted to toy with the knowledge of those who'd played the original, giving little breathing room for error, with constantly changing environments and new hooks during backtracking. The basic Resident Evil formula of finding clues, solving puzzles and managing items hasn't changed all that much in over 20 years, but the remake's clever implementation of risk-reward calculation gives the RPD new depth, and, coupled with a few careful but tasteful changes, allows the Resident Evil 2 name to take its place in the upper echelons of survival horror, not just once, but twice. And that was the art of the Raccoon City Police Department, one of the most iconic levels in survival horror history. What's your favourite Resident Evil level? Let us know in the comments, and for more art of the level, and more video games in general, stick with IGN.